Hello. Story 1. The year was 2018. Around the middle of the year, I was 23 years old and had taken a drive southward towards Vermont to spend time with my family for a period of several weeks. While I was there, I also had a strong desire to engage in camping activities, as my parents' dwelling was situated just outside the region known as the Appalachian Mountains. During the time I resided with them previously, I frequently went outdoors for such activities. However, since relocating, I had not been presented with the opportunity to go camping or even hiking at all. There existed a particular location that had occupied my thoughts for a considerable duration. Prior to my move, I discovered information regarding a specific trail mentioned on a message board tailored for individuals who investigate derelict buildings, and I had harbored a wish to explore it ever since. It was said that this particular trail led directly to an antiquated lodge positioned squarely within the heart of the forest. Thus, on a Monday morning, I undertook the drive to the location. I left my vehicle parked adjacent to the roadway, and the path was conspicuously lacking in any markers or designations. It was evident that this was merely an unrefined route forged by various individuals, much like myself, who held an interest in investigating the deserted lodge. Nonetheless, it was significantly encroached upon by vegetation, suggesting that the route had not been traversed by anyone recently. The journey along this path extended for slightly less than a 2-hour period. Although the terrain was predominantly level, the trek proved rather challenging owing to the abundance of weeds and bushes that had encroached upon the walkway. But regardless, I successfully reached my destination. Initially, my intention was to establish my campsite within the lodge itself, considering the opportunity. However, I had prudently equipped myself with a tent and all necessary provisions in anticipation of the structure being entirely dilapidated or otherwise unsuitable. It was fortunate that I had done so, because upon observing the exterior, it became unequivocally apparent that it was certainly not secure enough for camping. A significant portion of the roof was absent, having collapsed inward upon itself, and the timber from which it was constructed was infested with dense fungi and mildew. The entrance door, however, stood fully ajar, permitting me to cautiously insert my head and survey the interior. The odor emanating from within was repulsive, and due to the ubiquitous presence of decomposed and ruined elements, there was limited accessibility to areas that I could examine. Situated at the opposite extremity of the primary corridor was an entryway that appeared undamaged, and I attempted to reach it. But the passage proved somewhat too precarious, leading me ultimately to withdraw. Following that point, my schedule held no further predetermined activities. Nevertheless, as the sun commenced its descent, I initiated a search within the surrounding area for an appropriate location to establish my camp. The available sites were notably scarce, So I primarily proceeded roughly 200 feet away from the lodge and prepared a compact space suitable for erecting my tent. With the setting of the sun, the encroaching darkness gradually enveloped the distant lodge until it was no longer visible. Subsequently, the varied noises of the forest transitioned into the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the gentle crackling of the modest campfire I had constructed. Situated at the opposite extremity of the primary corridor was an entryway that appeared undamaged, and I attempted to reach it. But the passage proved somewhat too precarious, leading me ultimately to withdraw. Following that point, my schedule held no further predetermined activities. Nevertheless, as the sun commenced its descent, I initiated a search within the surrounding area for an appropriate location to establish my camp. The available sites were notably scarce, so I primarily proceeded roughly 200 feet away from the lodge and prepared a compact space suitable for erecting my tent. With the setting of the sun, the encroaching darkness gradually enveloped the distant lodge until it was no longer visible. Subsequently, the varied noises of the forest transitioned into the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the gentle crackling of the modest campfire I had constructed. My earnest desire was to observe the stars, yet the particular location I had chosen was overshadowed by towering trees that obstructed the majority of the skyward view. Furthermore, the sky was partly obscured by clouds. Consequently, I remained seated, intermittently placing twigs into the fire and contemplating whatever thoughts arose, until my attention was drawn by an auditory event. I am uncertain how precisely to characterize it, but the sound possessed considerable volume. Perhaps it resembled the noise of wood yielding or distorting. And even though the lodge was no longer within my sight, the sound originated from the precise area where I was certain the lodge was situated within the darkness. The sound persisted for only a brief duration of a few seconds, yet it induced a sensation of coldness throughout my body. Conceivably, it was merely the aging timber yielding and producing creaking sounds due to the wind. Or it is possible that it was something altogether different. I remained seated and listened intently for a significant period, approximating 30 minutes, without detecting any further sounds. The night had only progressed by approximately an hour, yet I recognized that failure to investigate the source of the sound at that moment would inevitably preclude me from sleeping later. So, I concluded that I might as well proceed to examine the vicinity while the night was still relatively young. I replenished my campfire with additional fuel in the form of sticks prior to departing, ensuring that I would not be required to reconstruct it upon my return. Following this, I retrieved my compact LED illumination device and proceeded on foot in the general direction of the lodge. Subsequent to merely a minute of traversing the distance, the edifice became faintly discernible within the beam of light. Its appearance was unsettling, precisely as anticipated. I approached it with caution, moving past several damaged window openings and holding the light source aloft. The interior was characterized by profound darkness. Even with the aid of the light, it seemed as though my vision was significantly impeded. Upon reaching the entrance door, I experienced a moment of surprise. It was no longer open. It was closed. I had been present at this location less than 2 hours prior and had departed, leaving it fully open. Then, my attention was drawn to another observation. The entire front surface of the door bore marks resembling scratches, perhaps inflicted by fingernails, or possibly a blade. I had not observed these markings during my previous visit, so I was uncertain if they had existed previously or had recently been created, perhaps constituting the very sound I had heard. For a brief moment, I contemplated whether I ought even attempt to open it, or if it would be wiser to simply depart. But this deliberation proved futile, for when I ultimately resolved to open it, I found myself unable to do so. It gave the distinct impression that some force was keeping it secured from the opposing side. I became profoundly disturbed and did not remain any further. I withdrew from the vicinity of the lodge and hastened back into the surrounding woods in the direction of my campsite. Nevertheless, I instantly perceived that an issue existed. Apart from the illumination provided by my lantern, no other light emanated from within the forest. I began to accelerate my pace, hopeful that I was still proceeding in the correct route. Fortunately, this proved to be the case, and approximately a minute thereafter, I successfully returned to where my tent was situated. A vertical mass of smoke ascended into the atmosphere above what had been my campfire, giving the appearance that someone had suddenly extinguished it while it was still ablaze. I scanned the area, remaining stationary and holding my lantern elevated, able to discern hardly anything among the surrounding trees. "Hello?" I called out. "Hello? Is anyone present?" No voice offered a reply. Beginning once more to experience sensations of coldness traversing my body, I was acutely aware that the return journey to the location of my automobile would require merely a 2-hour trek, leading me to swiftly make the decision to dismantle my camp and depart. I disassembled my tent, and as I hurriedly inserted the few remaining items into my rucksack, I detected an auditory phenomenon originating from nearby. I paused momentarily and raised my lantern aloft, yet my vision apprehended nothing. The sound resembled that of someone engaging in laughter. It was quiet, and not characteristic of someone sharing amusement with companions or similar circumstances. It was the sound of a solitary individual, softly laughing beneath their respiration as they observed me from concealed positions behind the trees within the obscurity, suggesting a state of mental instability. I expedited my actions, abandoning residual materials and swiftly making my way toward the trail with my inadequate lantern. Navigating the path proved exceedingly challenging, but I exerted my utmost effort. On multiple occasions, I halted under the impression that I had again heard that subdued laughter and became apprehensive that I was being pursued. But whoever was engaged in stalking me in that outdoor environment possessed the ability to merge seamlessly with the darkness, as I never managed to catch even a fleeting glimpse of them. I eventually reached the road, entered my vehicle, and drove away. 7 years following that occurrence, I reflect upon it as the singular most unsettling and terrifying event I have encountered in my existence. I doubt whether any individual can fully grasp the profound sense of powerlessness I experienced while being present in that forest, located in an isolated area during the nighttime and being pursued by someone seemingly unstable. It is conceivable that they had established their dwelling within that deserted lodge. I genuinely possess no certainty regarding this. However, based upon all that I observed and underwent during my time there, I am of the opinion that no one ought to return to ascertain the truth. Story 2. This particular event occurred last year, specifically during the summer season. I was traversing a path while backpacking toward a modest camping area, accompanied by my canine companion, Max. Max is an Australian shepherd, characterized as a dog of medium stature and considerable intelligence, who accompanies me on all my travels. He consistently demonstrates enthusiasm for running freely and hiking through forested environments. The destination we were journeying towards was a location I had previously visited on 3 or 4 separate occasions. I held a fondness for this place because of its secluded nature and the fact that it was consistently devoid of other people, thereby allowing Max the liberty to run unrestrained by a leash and derive pleasure from his surroundings. The designated camping site was situated an 8-hour walk along the trail, meaning that by the moment we arrived there, it was merely an hour or perhaps 2 prior to the setting of the sun. The camping area itself lacked any distinguishing or particularly scenic qualities. It consisted solely of a small, cleared space encircled entirely by trees. I perceived it as a tranquil and pleasant place to spend time, and sufficiently secure for me to permit Max to wander freely while still being able to maintain visual supervision over him. I deposited my backpack and commenced the process of arranging my equipment, which is typically when Max undertakes his brief reconnaissance around the perimeter of the campsite. I observed him engaging in olfactory exploration and venturing a short distance into the wooded area, while I proceeded with the erection of our tent, followed by the unpacking of the remaining items into the interior of the tent. Approximately 15 minutes subsequent to our arrival, Max came back to the campsite, but he was acting strange. His tail was lowered, and he came right up to me, then rotated his body to face the direction from which he had just emerged, looking out into the woods. I almost never see him act like this, unless there was a thunderstorm or something he was afraid of. I rose to my feet and directed my gaze towards the area he had come from. but I could discern nothing. I then conducted an examination of him, verifying that he had not inadvertently stepped upon something that might have caused him injury. Yet he was entirely unharmed, merely appearing anxious for an indeterminate reason. This behavior was quite disconcerting, particularly originating from a canine as intelligent and competent as Max was. I maintained a vigilant watch while I completed the establishment of the camp and commenced the construction of the campfire. During these activities, Max remained constantly by my side, not venturing off to explore or engage in other typical activities, but instead simply accompanying me and maintaining his gaze directed towards the woods. I must admit, each instance I turned to survey the forested area, I experienced a peculiar sensation of disquiet, akin to being observed. I dismissed this feeling, attributing it to Max's behavior, simply inducing nervousness within me, since I visually perceived nothing, yet the thought never truly departed from my consciousness. I successfully ignited the campfire precisely as the sun dipped below the crowns of the trees, thereby casting a dark shadow over the woods. The environment was silent, as it characteristically was. However, I did not experience the usual level of tranquility. I surmised that this would be the case owing to Max's atypical conduct, but I entertained the hope that on the following day, circumstances would revert to a more ordinary state, allowing us to resume our enjoyment of the excursion. Throughout the night, nonetheless, I merely attended to the fire and stayed near Max, paying attention to the auditory phenomena of the forest. Yet, subsequently, approximately an hour subsequent to the setting of the sun, Max abruptly raised his head alertly and became immobile. He directed an anxious gaze outward towards the trees, with his ears erect and his tail positioned between his legs. I looked in the same direction, but the pervasive darkness consumed the area, rendering anything beyond a range of 20 to 30 feet entirely obscured from view. He commenced emitting soft whining sounds, fixing his stare upon the impenetrable darkness situated beyond the trees. Placing my trust in his intuition that something was amiss, I retrieved my portable electric torch and directed its beam outward into that area. Perceiving little of significance, I began to advance a short distance further into the woods. Max kept pace directly behind me. I was reluctant to stray too far from the immediate vicinity of the campfire, but during the 50 feet or so that I proceeded outward, I visually detected nothing within the wooded landscape. We subsequently returned and resumed our seated positions. Despite my inability to discern anything visually, I was confident that Max would not be exhibiting this behavior without a valid underlying cause. However, the most probable explanation, and one I admittedly hoped for, was simply the presence of some type of wild creature moving about within the vicinity. We were not situated within terrain known to be frequented by bears, yet I nonetheless carry bear repellent on my person, a deterrent that would be effective against any animal, thus alleviating significant concern for our security. Max maintained a state of heightened vigilance throughout the entire night, but he did not exhibit any further instances of abrupt alarm. And a few hours subsequently, we entered the tent and retired for the night. I could perceive that Max was fatigued, likely as a consequence of the considerable apprehension he was experiencing, and I felt a sense of relief upon observing him close his eyes and drift into slumber within approximately 15 minutes. I followed suit shortly thereafter. This may strike some as peculiar, but during the course of that night, I recall experiencing a dream that involved traversing a forested area during the nighttime. I was unaccompanied. Max was not with me, and my actions consisted merely of walking amongst the trees, not following any discernible path or route. In the central part of that dream, I began to detect a sound characterized by a high frequency. Repeatedly, this sound continued until abruptly I jolted awake. Max was gently pushing against my face, using his nose and whining in my ear, producing the very high-pitched sound I had been perceiving within my dream, which instantly caused me to comprehend that he had been endeavoring to awaken me for a duration. I adopted a seated posture and grasped my portable electric torch, experiencing a surge of anxiety as I unfastened the tent zipper and exited to survey the surroundings. I activated the flashlight, poised to scrutinize the area, but the moment the beam of light was emitted, it illuminated an individual positioned directly before me, perhaps approximately 10 feet distant from the tent. This person was attired entirely in dark-colored clothing, with the hood of a sweatshirt obscuring approximately half of their countenance, revealing only a visibly unkempt beard. However, I rapidly observed a glint of light emanating from their hand, perceiving the small metallic surface of a folding blade reflecting the light back in my direction. During that fleeting instant, I simply became paralyzed, as though my entire physical form had undergone an abrupt state of shock. The man also paused for a moment, but subsequently began to advance forward once more when Max initiated vocalizations of growling. Up until that instant, I had not even become aware that he had exited the tent and was positioned directly beside me. This circumstance caused the man to pause, affording me additional time to regain my composure and swiftly reach into the tent to retrieve the bear repellent. By the time I had straightened up, Max was vociferously barking and moving erratically, deliberately positioning himself between us. The man did not take any further steps forward and simply pivoted and fled into the wooded area. Fortunately, Max did not pursue him. I commenced the process of dismantling all my equipment and packing as he maintained his head elevated and patrolled the periphery of the campsite, providing a protective presence over the entire vicinity. Once everything was packed, we began our return journey down the path. Candidly, even with adrenaline still coursing through my system throughout the entirety of the hike back, I did not experience profound fear. Understanding the effectiveness with which Max managed the encounter, we successfully returned without harm and departed from that location. I undertook the necessary actions to report the occurrence. However, I believe that due to the specific site and and other contributing factors, a thorough investigation was not conducted. In any event, I have participated in numerous camping excursions subsequent to that time, and Max has reverted to his customary state, exhibiting happiness and exploring the forested environments as he typically does. At the very least, I now possess the understanding that if he exhibits mistrust regarding something, the most prudent course of action is simply to withdraw from the situation. Story 3. I was engaged in hiking towards a viewpoint of considerable renown situated just beyond the confines of Glacier National Park, which is located in Montana. The vista certainly did not rival the grandeur of any of the perspectives found within Glacier National Park, but it was simply a standard hiking path, devoid of particular regulations or restrictions. Furthermore, the period was immediately preceding winter, which in this locality signifies the cessation of the peak season for most hiking and camping activities, thereby indicating that no other individuals would likely be present. I was not averse to the cold climate, and consequently, it was agreeable to have both the trail and the elevated viewpoint entirely to myself. I concluded the ascent hike at approximately 5:30 in the evening, indicating that the journey had consumed nearly 6 hours. Essentially, situated atop the mountain was an expansive grassy expanse featuring a pair of circular arrangements constructed from stone, intended for establishing campfires and facilitating the setup of tents around them. And a short distance further upwards was a sheer rock face that afforded a panoramic view encompassing the entire valley, populated by mountains and forested areas. It was quite probable that one could visually perceive Glacier National Park itself from this vantage point on a day characterized by good visibility. In any case, as I had anticipated, no other individuals were present at either the camping area or the elevated viewpoint. I arranged all of my equipment adjacent to the stone circle nearest to the overlook and prepared a swift evening meal for myself, after which I proceeded to position myself on the periphery of the cliff face in order to witness the descent of the sun. I must state that there was a considerable vertical drop situated beneath the overlook, which initially felt somewhat intimidating, but the spectacle of the sun lowering itself over the mountainous terrain caused me to entirely disregard this fact. I remained seated there and observed it for a full 30 minutes until it descended below the horizon and the external environment became dark. Experiencing a sense of well-being, I rose to my feet and pivoted to commence my return journey towards my campsite. But I nearly recoiled in surprise when I observed an individual standing directly behind me, within the dense shrubbery near the border of the woods. He was directing his gaze squarely at me. However, the element that rendered the encounter particularly unsettling was that immediately upon my noticing him, he simply rotated his body and departed without delay. My ability to perceive significant details of his appearance was limited, given the prevailing darkness outdoors and his position within the bushes. Nonetheless, the man was conspicuously not carrying a backpack. Consequently, I speculated that he must have arrived at the campsite shortly after me and had already completed the arrangement of his belongings. From my location at the overlook, my visual range was effectively confined to my own setup, excluding any view of the other segments of the campsite. However, upon approaching closer, I still did not perceive any other setups, and the direction the man had taken into the forest was not oriented towards the campsite either. I considered this sequence of events to be exceedingly strange, but I proceeded with my evening. I placed several dry twigs into the stone circle and ignited a campfire, then erected my small camping chair and occupied a position beside the fire. My agenda for that night was relatively empty. Truthfully, I had no specific plan for this excursion. My sole desire was to arrive at this location and dedicate the entirety of the day and night to relaxation and appreciation of the forested surroundings. Therefore, that is what I attempted to accomplish. A period of several hours elapsed. I estimate the time was approaching 11 o'clock in the evening when I detected the sound of footsteps originating from somewhere ahead of my position. Naturally, my vision was unable to discern anything, but the sound bore an uncanny resemblance to human footsteps, sequentially placed one after the other, and not situated at a great distance within the woods. Relatively soon after perceiving these sounds, I verbally inquired, asking if there was anyone present in that area. The footsteps ceased momentarily, as though the source hesitated, and then resumed walking. But whatever entity was present in the external environment, they did not provide a response. Even though it sounded exactly like human footsteps, without being able to see them and without them responding, I had to believe that it was just an animal, like maybe a cervid or similar creature. This reasoning was based on the premise that if it were a person, they would undoubtedly respond, and furthermore, it lacked any logical basis for someone to be perambulating in this manner at that specific hour. Eventually, nonetheless, the auditory indications of movement gradually diminished. An additional hour transpired as I remained seated beside the campfire. I did not consciously perceive the footsteps as having rendered me excessively apprehensive or frightened, yet they must have had such an effect, as I remained remarkably alert, unequivocally incapable of achieving sleep, notwithstanding the fact that it had already passed midnight. Following a period of time, I recognized that I would not be retiring for the night in the near future, and a sense of monotony was setting in, prompting me to proceed to the elevated viewpoint to ascertain whether the stars might be visible. I allowed the fire to continue burning and rose from my position, walking towards the cliff edge. The celestial conditions were not exceptionally clear. Nevertheless, the moon was emitting sufficient radiance downwards to project an illuminated glow across the mountains and the forested landscape. The air movement was soothing and hushed, drifting gently across the valley. I remained standing at that spot for approximately 1 minute before, with suddenness, multiple twigs broke audibly behind me, and a dense shrubbery agitated aggressively. I rapidly rotated my body, visually identifying that same individual from the earlier encounter. But on this occasion, he did not avert his gaze or turn away. He advanced through the shrubbery and commenced walking rapidly towards the overlook. I began to vocalize inquiries regarding his purpose in being present at this location, but the man simply spoke over me, maintaining a disquieting artificial smile as he kept moving closer, saying random nonsense and deliberately refraining from providing answers to any of my inquiries or even acknowledging anything I articulated. The manner in which he was advancing towards me was profoundly frightening, and I attempted to maneuver to the side, but he was swift in positioning himself back in front of me. And unexpectedly, within the intense emotional state of the moment, I apprehended the imminent danger. He extended his hands and lunged towards me, attempting to propel me over the precipice. I was fortunate, expressing gratitude, that I had been psychologically prepared for this action and possessed a firm stance. And furthermore, I possessed a slightly larger physical build than the individual, enabling me to forcefully push him backward and distance myself from the cliff edge. As he lost his balance, I attempted to retreat rapidly towards the campsite, but he managed to overtake me quite swiftly. This time, he made no effort to conceal his malicious intention. His countenance was terrifyingly consumed by anger and intense fury. I can barely conceive of the extent of my good fortune that this individual did not possess any kind of implement serving as a weapon, as he would assuredly not have shown any reluctance to employ it. We engaged in a physical struggle for perhaps a duration of 30 seconds, but I consistently held the advantage over him. The man appeared rather slender, suggesting a period of insufficient nourishment, yet he was singularly resolute in his determination to incapacitate me. Nevertheless, subsequent to several unsuccessful attempts, he was ultimately sufficiently overcome to retreat by running away. I made no attempt whatsoever to pursue him or restrain him. Given the remote location, engaging further simply did not warrant the potential hazards. I collected all of my possessions, affixed my head-mounted lamp, and departed from the campsite. I successfully traversed approximately 2 hours of the return journey down the trail before the energy supply of my headlamp was depleted. Consequently, I established a makeshift small camp within the woods and remained there awaiting the arrival of dawn, subsequently completing the remainder of the hike back. I formally submitted an account of the incident and engaged in discussions with numerous individuals regarding my encounter. Yet each person held differing interpretations concerning the true purpose of the man's presence in that remote location. My sole certainty is that my life could potentially have been extinguished on that particular night, had I exercised even a marginally lesser degree of caution. Bye.